One of the common ways we've described our community of faith is that we have given up dishonest certainty in favor of honest uncertainty. Especially for those of us who came from fundamentalist religious backgrounds, there was some point in our spiritual journeys when we turned that corner and made that choice. For me, if I look back, I think about those days where I was a true believer. It's strange to remember when outrageous and outlandish claims appeared self-evident. There was no need to prove any of them. They felt obviously true. You could feel it. They were just so obvious. There were other claims that I accepted more unwillingly, but I accepted them nonetheless. They seemed to be required, and I was assured over and over again that there was a long history of people that knew better than me and who had steadfastly believed in those things. When that internal world began to crumble around 2006 or so, I became resolute. I will not be duped again. I'm not going to fall for it. However, that resolution requires more diligent practice than I would have initially guessed. There was a whole world of outrageous claims to avoid, to be sure. And keeping up on the ongoing research dedicated to understanding the world takes more than just a little commitment and time. There was more to it than that, though. As long as I could remember, I had used my dishonest certainty to cope with my depressive tendencies. Embracing honest uncertainty also meant taking seriously my own mental and emotional well-being in ways that I hadn't done before, that had not even been possible before. And that was great, but it was also a lot of hard work. Along the way, I began exploring how that dishonest certainty had helped me cope with both traumatic experiences and with the everyday complexities of life. My local church, the Fellowship of Dishonest Certainty, had also been my main source of community, not to mention my source of income and employment. Leaving that community meant losing networks and relationships and resources. There was a lot more uncertainty to embrace than just my beliefs. Like all humans, I've experienced hardship, from health conditions to traumatic experiences to economic vulnerability to marginalization and rejection. My irrational religious beliefs and the church that went along with them gave me something that felt like solid ground to stand on. In my case, it didn't make me passive. I found myself most at home among the troublemakers of Christian history, folks who stood up to injustice, embodied radical compassion, and insisted that the world could be and would be a different place. I still claim that history. I still see myself as a part of it, but the certainty is gone. Being honest just about just how far that uncertainty extends into my daily life is, however, not usually either comfortable or easy. And that's why I chose the wisdom lesson from today from the poet David White. Honesty, he said, is reached by the doorway of grief and loss. Where we cannot go in our mind, our memory, or our body is where we cannot be straight with another, our world, or ourself. And then he says some of I think the most poetic ways to put this possible. He says, honesty is not the revealing of some foundational truth that gives us power over life or another or even the self, but a robust incarnation into the unknown, unfolding vulnerability of existence. Just a beautiful turn of phrase. A robust incarnation into the unknown, unfolding vulnerability of existence. It's beautiful and it's also terrifying. He goes on to say, where we acknowledge in this place how powerless we feel, how little we actually know, how afraid we are of not knowing, and how astonished we are by the generous measure of loss that is conferred upon even the most average life. In other words, while humans have created oppressive systems that create a boundless amount of unnecessary suffering in the world, some amount of suffering, some amount of uncertainty is inescapable. And learning to honestly face the things that make us recoil, the experiences and circumstances we feel compelled to avoid or to hide, is a vital part of growing into our full humanity, a robust incarnation into the way things are with a grateful, kind wisdom. But that recoil is real. Against our embrace of honest uncertainty is the fear of loss And maybe perhaps we don't talk enough about this. It's also the risk of false hope. There's been a very small, just really small subset of human beings, mostly in places like the United States, who have been able to believe without question in the inevitable progress and stability of the world. But that has not been a safe assumption for most humans during most of history, with the only certainties that are offered to the masses being exclusion, coercion, and exploitation. And though it seems to be amazingly easy to forget the past uncertainties, that's probably an evolutionary quality that helps us survive, recent years have forced more and more US residents to remember how uncertain the world is. Since 2014, researchers at Chapman University in Orange, California have used an annual survey to document the way that normal folks in the USA have experienced uncertainty and fear. The topics of their survey range from government to natural disasters to personal anxieties. And over these last 5 years, two striking trends have emerged from that survey. First, people in the United States are becoming more and more afraid. In 2016, for example, the number one fear in the nation was held in common by about 60% of the respondents. And the other fears in the top 10 were held by no more than 40% of the population. In 2018, the most recent survey, the top fear, which was government corruption, by the way, was shared by 73.6% of the population. And all of the top 10 fears were held by more than half of Americans. So fears are increasing. More people are feeling afraid. And the second trend is, probably not any surprise, the rising anxiety due to environmental concerns. In 2016, not one of the top 10 fears in the United States was an environmental fear. In 2018, 5 of the top 10 fears all had to do with environmental concerns. And it's no wonder. After all, the World Health Organization has estimated an increase of 250,000 excess deaths per year between 2030 and 2050 due to what they called, quote, well-understood impacts of climate change. And we already know that environmental catastrophes have profound and negative impact on mental health. For example, researchers have documented the relationship between depression and PTSD with natural disasters such as hurricanes. As these disasters occur more frequently, so will the resultant mental health issues. And another recent study showed that living with impacts of climate change has already resulted in significantly worsened mental health. For every degree, the researchers wrote, of average temperature increase, mental health worsened by a 2% increase in the rate of reported mental health issues. In other words, over time, that translates across the nation to nearly 2 million extra people with mental health difficulties in any given month when the weather is worse. As a result, psychologists have coined a new term. They call it climate anxiety, as a way to better understand how climate change exacerbates our mental health woes, such as anxiety and depression. And I think that's important to note when we look at a list of fears like this. We aren't just being pessimistic. We aren't just making up impacts. The same could be said of the other fears on this list, none of which are unreasonable, none of which are outrageous. On a host of urgent issues facing our society, there are some very good reasons to feel concern, outrage, and even fear. And yet here we are, a community that has committed itself to honest uncertainty. In an era of climate anxiety and growing fear, that honesty has to include our struggles to enter into uncertainty, to acknowledge our relative powerlessness, because I think that's a universal feeling, isn't it? We look at everything happening, we think, well, just what can I even do about this? And then, in spite of all that, to resolve to keep making decisions and to keep living life in ways that would make a sustainable, just future possible. A failure to do so only makes us increasingly vulnerable to the very dishonesty that we claimed we had already discarded. A failure to do so makes us increasingly vulnerable to inaction, either because we avoid the issues that feel overwhelming to us, or because we create a false optimism that everything's going to turn out okay. We don't have to worry about that at all. Both of those paths easily lead to inaction. Both lead to an accommodation of injustice. If I'm being honest, my own preferred weakness has always been despair. I'm not saying I am immune to optimism, but I can say it has never stuck. It's become something of a truism that humanity has a technology to build just and sustainable societies right now, and we've had that ability for some time, but we don't yet have the psychology for it. Our best hope is that we somehow survive as a species long enough for our psychology and the related structures and cultures to catch up. I don't think that's certain at all. And yet, I also know that if we give up, there's no chance at all. So I drag my discouraged self out again and again to try to do the work of social change. I am not an optimist, but I have become somewhat skilled at not giving up. I'm convinced, with Václav Havel, that hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing, no matter how it turns out. I'll read that one more time. Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing, no matter how it turns out. And that is a type of honest certainty that I think I can live with. I haven't yet found a really comprehensive tool for intentionally reflecting on these kinds of issues, and Western models often seem deficient to me in several key areas. Martin Seligman's PERMA model, which I'll reflect on in just a moment, is no exception. It's too often been used prescriptively when, if I understand it correctly, it was intended as a descriptive and a theoretical model. It's perhaps too focused on an individual's psychology and doesn't adequately include physical well-being or social systems that we belong to. And it generally isn't oriented around or inclusive enough of the experiences of oppressed and marginalized communities. That being said, I have found it helpful as a reflective practice and a good way to help me navigate that treacherous strait between naivety on one side and despair on the other. And I think this model can provide a bit of a check-in, helping me notice my discouragement before it blossoms into depression. And it can be a practical action, something I can do when I don't feel like I can do anything or something and I don't know what to do. My reflections, I really don't enjoy acronyms. I don't even know, PERMA, I don't know why the order for that, P-E-R-M-A, so I'm going to do it out of order on what makes sense to me, if you'll forgive me. So my reflections begin with Seligman's fourth aspect, meaning. And the way I understand this section of the model has to do with intention and aspiration, with getting in touch with what inspires us and keeps us going. And we recognize aspiration when you can feel your heart rising instead of sinking. You know that sinking feeling? It happens every time you turn on the news. So we're looking for the opposite of that, of when the heart rises. When you think about those things that make life most meaningful to you. My personal practice is when I sit down to meditate in the morning, I begin that meditation with getting in touch with the aspirations that have struck most with me, and that is to experience life with curiosity, with kindness, and with gratitude. I'm trying to make a space where wisdom can grow, where I'm not just bouncing back and forth from one reaction to another. So that's my three aspirations. I want to experience life with curiosity, kindness, and gratitude. And then I try to take those aspirations with me throughout the day. And I find that by building them into my meditation practice, they become something of a habit where I'll experience something in the day and I can immediately get in touch with those aspirations. Well, how do I want to respond to this? Where do I want my focus to be? And I can come back to those touchstones of curiosity, kindness, and gratitude. I usually get mad for just a little bit, but then I can get in touch with those aspirations. And those aspirations are closely related to how we think about society and our vision for what society could become. So socially, my aspirations are oriented around building equality and community, of dismantling oppressive systems and establishing social relationships that are non-hierarchical, that are just and kind. And those, I think, are applications of those three personal aspirations. What would it look like if we all went through this world and treated each other with aspirations to be curious and kind and grateful with one another? And I think about what that would look like as a society. We spend a lot of time focusing on the things we have to resist, and we don't always have a choice in that matter, do we? We have to notice, we have to resist oppression and environmental destruction. It's really important that we pay attention to those things. But Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educator, reminded us that we have to announce the new way, the new world, with just as much enthusiasm, with just as much time and effort and energy as we denounce the way things are. And that can be difficult, especially when there is simply so much suffering. But I can tell you personally, despair has never been closer at hand than when I lose touch with my intentions and with my aspirations. That's when I'm most vulnerable to giving up, is when I lose touch with those things. By getting in touch, remembering our aspirations, we remind ourselves what we are fighting for, why our effort is important and beautiful, and why not only we cannot give up, but why we don't want to give up. And I think this connects very well with the second aspect that Seligman talks about, which is engagement. If something happening in the world is feeling particularly overwhelming, it can be helpful, hopeful, and empowering to do something practical, no matter how small, especially in cooperation with others, that connects us in that really hands-on way with our aspirations. That can be tricky because there's only so much that any one of us can do, and there's this ongoing dialogue between engagement and equanimity. All of us need rest. All of us need to work with our limitations, and all of us have to figure out what works for our own unique selves. For example, there is a steady stream, you probably have noticed, of bad news when it comes to the exclusion and bigotry aimed at queer folk, such as the recent decision by the United Methodist General Conference to exclude LGBT folk from leadership positions and even from marriage. And while the Methodists were busy getting most of the news, you might not have noticed that the first anti-LGBTQ bill of 2019 here in Missouri, House Bill 927, was introduced into the House on February 25th. And that bill would empower student groups on campus to use their religious beliefs as a cover to discriminate against LGBT students. There seems to be no end to this kind of thing, and it is often overwhelming. So in addition to supporting and participating in organizations like the ACLU, I need to do something else. I need to engage locally to keep me in touch with those aspirations. So I help facilitate local transgender and non-binary support groups in town. And I'll be honest, it is often exhausting. It requires a lot of time, a great deal of emotional and physical energy, but you know, it's also energizing. It gives us a chance to make a space where we can intentionally and lovingly accept and care for one another. So even though the conversations and situations that we discuss at those groups can be heavy, there's also a lot of joy. I know that this work isn't going to solve everything, but it keeps me engaged. It reminds me that my identity and my well-being are important and beautiful and real, no matter what terrible news might come my way. An engagement like this also brings us into community, which Seligman talks about as relationships that can sustain us. Most of you already know my stories of growing up as a queer person in Southwest Missouri, overflowing with my own internalized oppression. Last June, a straight friend of mine from out of town joined me here to celebrate Pride Fest, and we went to the parade and the activities on the square. And I was introducing him to folks, and you could see him, he was slowly realizing that for the first time in his life, he was completely surrounded by queer people. And he was looking increasingly a little uncomfortable. And I felt so happy, not because he was uncomfortable, I felt so happy because it dawned on me how many wonderful friendships that I now had in the queer community in Springfield. And you know, growing up here, I didn't even know that, I wasn't allowed to know that that community even existed. And now my life was overflowing with these wonderful, joyful relationships. So it might not sound like a big deal, but it really, really was. When we moved back here, back to this area in 2010, I felt increasingly isolated. Getting involved with activities and organizations that advocated for LGBT rights and well-being made it possible for me to find a larger network of friends and fellow activists and allies than I'd ever dreamt possible. I still remember the joy and relief of sitting in a room for the first time and realizing that every one of us in that room all identified as both non-binary and somewhere on the asexual spectrum. And for once, we didn't have to explain anything to anyone. We could just be ourselves. There's a parallel experience for most of us, I think, when we gather here, where we can unite around the crucial social justice issues of the day without having to argue about it, we have disagreements, but on the key issues, we have an agreement that these things are important. We know that Black lives matter and that Native lives matter. We stand on the side of immigrants and refugees. We work for economic dignity and justice and insist on the value of labor against the insatiable greed of those who hoard power and wealth. We believe that education, healthcare, and housing are human rights, and that our policies and our communities should reflect that truth. We know that women's and LGBT rights are human rights. We know that our well-being and our very survival as a planet necessitates caring for both, restoring ecosystems, creating sustainable, regenerative societies. And because we share all these convictions and others like them, we can relate with each other much more freely. We're not all best friends, and some people annoy others, but despite all those things, we trust each other more readily. And I'm really happy when we get to know each other a little bit better. And I don't find that very many places. I go to a lot of places in Springfield and I'm kind of looking over my shoulder, how much can I say before someone's going to get upset with me? I don't have to worry about that here. And that is an extraordinary gift. There's a lot more to be said about relationships, but since I'm preaching about social rejection in April, I'm going to leave it at that today. Instead, I want to just briefly focus on the role of cultivating positive emotions and recognizing accomplishments, were the other two of Seligman's points. I like to think about positive emotion in terms of gratitude and goodwill. Too often, positive psychology, as it's been popularly presented, I think has fallen short when it comes to addressing issues and populations related to oppression and social justice. It's too easy to talk about positive emotion in such a way that just makes people feel guilty for not feeling happy, or to make them feel obligated to try and create those emotions, which is just a frustrating experience. And it doesn't make anything better, especially in situations of injustice. A wide range of emotions are appropriate responses to the suffering in this world, and that includes anger and grief. We move forward through those emotions, not by denying them. Yet it's also true, at least for me, that anger isn't the only emotion that we feel, and it isn't an emotion that sustains my activism or that sustains my well-being. It's when I'm in touch with my aspirations, when I engage in meaningful actions alongside people I care about, that gratitude and goodwill and those kinds of positive emotions arise quite naturally, and I don't have to force anything. I can just recognize it and enjoy those moments. We need the relief that comes with joy. When we're dealing with stressful, depressing circumstances, we can quite easily be carried along by our negativity bias. And it's easy to fall into the trap of identifying only with those stressors, like those are the only things that exist, to the neglect of everything else. So we need to take special care to recognize and savor the times when pleasure and joy break through into our experiences. We need to intentionally recognize gratitude when we feel it, and take time to enjoy and express that feeling. Similarly, when I feel the tug of despair, I don't force myself to feel something different than that. Instead, I pause and I get in touch with my goodwill and kindness, because even when the worst things are happening inside of me, they're not the only things that are happening inside of me. And I remember that I can be, my actions, my lives can be an expression of love for all of us who live on planet Earth, now and in the future. And when I do that, gratitude and goodwill I find are much better motivators for me. They energize me. And even if they don't make me optimistic, they do make me want to go on and not give up. And this is true for all the ways, little and large, that bring us closer to a more sustainable, just, and caring world. When the obstacles are so large and the journey is so long, we really need to take the time to celebrate accomplishments along the way. Back in 1984, Carl Weick pointed out that conceiving of social change on too massive a scale could actually be counterproductive. Anticipating the problem we began with today, Weick said this: "People often define social problems in ways that overwhelm their ability to do anything about them." When social problems are described this way, efforts to convey their gravity disable the very resources of thought and action necessary to change them. When the magnitude of problems is scaled upward in the interest of mobilizing action, the quality of thought and action declines because processes such as frustration, arousal, and helplessness are activated. In contrast, he said we should be focusing on a small win, because a small win has an immediacy, tangibility, and controllability that could reverse those other effects. By itself, one small win may seem unimportant. A series of wins at small but significant tasks, however, reveals a pattern that may attract allies, deter opponents, and lower resistance to subsequent proposals. In other words, this is how we build movements. This is how we build community. Practically speaking, this necessitates processes like strategic planning and action reflection, which have their own skill sets. But the principle is really, really simple. Identify your goal, make a plan, but break it up into small, manageable steps, and then celebrate those little accomplishments and make adjustments that keep you on track. Human psychology seems to thrive on these kinds of baby steps. In one study of workplace moods and activities, researchers generated 12,000 person days of data on moods and activities of people at work. And they came to the striking conclusion that a sense of incremental progress is vastly more important to happiness than either a grand mission or financial incentives. Small wins had a surprisingly strong positive effect, and small losses a surprisingly strong negative one. Anyone who knows the satisfaction of marking something off of your to-do list knows exactly what's being said here, right? We need to be realistic, yes. We need to acknowledge that the small acts we do are not sufficient to change everything in the world that needs to be changed. But our realism must also include human psychology, and it's very likely that we will find our greatest motivation and encouragement to keep doing this hard work of not standing idly by, of keeping doing the hard work of social change, when we take the time to recognize and celebrate, even and perhaps especially, the small accomplishments. All of this is to say that while we cannot offer guarantees, we left that behind. We can offer ourselves. We can refuse those easy pathways of inaction. We can even, sometimes and perhaps in small doses, honestly face those overwhelming difficulties that we face as a society. And we can act. We can offer patience as we wrestle with powerlessness. We can offer courage as we let go of ignorance. We can offer love as we move through loss. We can face uncertainty with honesty and grace. We can stay grounded in our best aspirations, and we can live out our convictions without guarantees, but with faithfulness to the best visions within us for communities that are wise and kind and just. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.